I was part of the Global Game Jam 2021, where the theme was Lost and Found. This meant that me and my team had roughly 3 days to create a video game virtually from scratch. So we thought that an interesting and novel approach to the Lost and Found theme would be diegetic navigation. The basic idea of our game was you are a tourist lost in a foreign subway station, and your goal is to find your destination without being able to read the signs. Now, the question is, how exactly do you make a game about navigation when you cannot understand the signs? That was the problem we had to solve. And we solved the problem, clearly, since this game is out and you're watching this video, and I'm about to tell you exactly how we solved that problem. But before that, a word from our sponsor. Not really. This is a completely free game, made in our spare time. We are making exactly 0 monies from this whole project, especially this video, which took me a whole month to put together. And by the way, please make sure you play through the game before continuing watching. It's roughly a 20 minutes experience, and this video is about to dive deep into the design aspects of the game, spoiling the ending and breaking all the illusions behind the game's systems. I'm Nick, by the way, the designer of Trainslation, and even though this is a small, silly little project, a surprising amount of work went into it. Now, this video is pretty long and is not designed to please the algorithm gods or to generate any money from ad revenue. It's more for those of you who find this kind of design deep dive interesting. It's for you. The thing is, normally, short indie games are made in months, some in years, but the idea of a game jam is to focus on an interesting mechanic and make it into a bare-bones functional prototype. So, with roughly 3 days at our disposal and a rough idea in mind, we started off by setting in stone 2 core design pillars that would dictate the direction of the game's development. First, the gameplay loop focus is on gathering and deciphering information, and second, everything is diegetic. This means that every piece of information has to belong in the game's world. No in-game menus, no UI, and no buttons. So, with the basic idea laid out and the design pillars set in stone, we set up a quick Trello board and started making a vague to-do list. Design a decently sized and interconnected map layout. We were aiming for at least 3 colored lines with around 20 stops. Create a subway system with functional trains, give the player a destination, populate each station with accurate signs indicating directions, and make all the signs in a foreign language. Scatter different types of information throughout multiple stations, requiring a little bit of exploration, and finally avoid information overload. So that means no timetables or overcrowded signs. Sounds like a pretty solid plan, right? The original team was composed out of 5 people, covering pretty much all the core disciplines of game development. But even though most of us knew what we were doing, not everything went as smooth as we wanted to. So this is me trying to shine a light on the huge amount of work that goes even in a short weekend project like this. First up, we put together some placeholder art, and my first and top priority was to get the map layout right. We ended up with more stations than we initially planned for, and I started distributing them equally on 4 lines so I can plot them on an easily editable map. Now, in order to create some replay value, we wanted to have the player's spawn point randomized every time the game starts, and this required a robust map layout design that is balanced and results in roughly the same playtime and difficulty every gameplay session. The secret to that robust map design is having the 4 colored tracks intersect with each other in a 2x2 formation. So for example, the yellow line never intersects with a green line and the blue line does not intersect with a red line. This design allows us to create the following 2 rules for the player's spawn condition. First, the player will always spawn on a randomly colored small station. That means that they will never spawn in a junction station. And second, the final ghost will always spawn on one of the small stations that does not intersect with the player's line color. These 2 simple rules ensure that every player starts on a new station and they have to change at least 2 trains at a major junction stop in order to reach their destination. This seems to satisfy the complexity and difficulty requirements I was going for in a purely procedural way. But even though the layout makes sense, how can I be sure that players can actually find their destination? I tried my best to make sure that the player knows their current location through various signs and color choices. For example, every station has several big signs with the station name on them using the same color as the train track color of that line, as well as various elements of the station itself being colored in that same hue to subconsciously reinforce what line the player is on. I didn't want any confusion about the player's current location because I think that would subtract from the puzzle and it would have been the artificial kind of difficult, which I hate. But when it comes to navigation, I had to be careful with the amount of information I reveal to the player so the puzzle of reaching the destination isn't too difficult but not too easy either. Therefore, I made the choice of having two types of navigational information. First, a directional sign that tells the player all the stop names on that colored line. I placed these signs on every small station above the train tracks at an angle that allows the player to quickly reference the current station name by having it on the screen in the background. These signs also label the different types of small and big junction stations through visual design, without really explaining what those bigger dots are, encouraging the player to go there and explore. The second type of navigational information are the map posters that reveal which lines are intersected and what are the names of the junction stations that connect them. In order to make sure that the puzzle isn't completely solved by the time the player sees this map, I made the conscious decision of leaving out the names of the small stations from this map. This requires a minimal level of memorization, pushing the player out of their comfort zone, asking them to memorize a word in a foreign language by not allowing them to see both the map and the names of all the stations on screen at the same time. Placing these signs throughout every station was quite a manual and tedious process, making sure all the information is correct even based on which side of the platform the sign was placed. However, after the jam ended, we created a script that makes the sign prefab automatically assign the correct color onto itself based on the closest train track it finds. This made placing signs significantly easier. When it came to recreating the map layout in-game, due to me not being very familiar with Unity, a lot of bad decisions were made regarding prefab management, and as a result, I had to do a lot of manual work to create the stations and place them correctly to replicate the map layout I originally designed. Each station has two tracks that needed to be manually linked to the previous and next stops. This was a very tedious task to do, knowing that if any mistake is made, the whole gameplay loop would break. Later during the jam, we created a debug tool that allows us to drag tracks on top of each other in order to link them. That being said, keeping track of all the stations and how they link to each other, including the junction points that act as crossroads between four stations, was difficult, to say the least, especially that all tracks had Cyrillic names and no one on the team had any idea how to read the Cyrillic alphabet. Fun. Therefore, in order to make sure we get things done within the jam deadline, we ended up sleeping roughly 4 to 5 hours each night, which can be seen from the timestamps on our Git commits that went up until 8 AM during certain nights. Please don't do what we did if you take part in a game jam. We are professionally trained idiots. Now, while I was putting together the final touches of the map layout and sign placements, Josh was putting together the basic functionalities of the train system. The trains themselves are rather interesting. They are actually created and simulated in real time regardless of what station you're in. It's pretty impressive to look from above and see this whole dumpster fire work so smoothly. At first, we had the train spawn for every station, which resulted in trains arriving at the station on both sides at the same time. This didn't feel right, and we wanted to add some sort of delay to the train schedule to create some variety. We didn't want to introduce new variables to this already fragile system, so the way we solved this problem was by simply spawning less trains than there are stations, which created gaps in the train line, resulting in enough variety in the arrival times that we were happy to ship the game with. There were many performance-related problems, specifically because we aimed for a near seamless transition between stations, which meant that all of our stations were in a single Unity scene. For example, once you get on a train, it starts moving and after a few seconds, it teleports to the next station. So in order to avoid computers catching on fire, we created a station streaming system where we render the current station you're on, and as soon as you step on a train and the doors close, the next station loads in order to allow for a near seamless transition. Even though we didn't get the transition to be perfect, there are a lot of elements and systems that come together to make the train experience as smooth as it currently is. Trains are animated by two separate easing curves. One for the train arriving in the station, heavily eased at the end to simulate the slow, gradual braking on the train car, and another one heavily eased at the beginning to simulate the train's weight during the slow acceleration period. These two animations play over a controlled set amount of time, with a wait period in between, during which time we play the doors opening animation. The train doors were coded in such a way that based on a label called platform side that we set on each station, we can control on which side the doors open. The opening animation is only a handful of keyframes I've put together. I thought it was cool to create that initial seal break after which the doors swing fully open. The closing animation is the same one as the opening one, but played in reverse. It looked good enough and saved us a few precious minutes during the tight deadline of the game jam. Later on in development, we also added a subtle screen shake animation tied directly to the train's movement speed in order to sell the effect even more. We wanted the train experience to be believable, and that leads me to one thing I despise in video games, and that is the player character glitching out whenever they are on a moving platform. It's a common oversight in most games, but I think it's incredibly distracting, especially in a game about immersion and diegetic design. We had to make sure that the player's character feels firmly planted on the train's floor, and for that we had to basically rewrite our own player controller code because the pre-made ones we found online were either too buggy or not good enough. As a result, when you're on board the train, the game calculates the train's velocity and adds it to your camera view every frame. And on top of that, if the train rotates, the game tracks your last position relative to the train's origin and adds that to your velocity as well. Sadly, we didn't get to take advantage of this last one because all our train tracks ended up being straight. However, it's worth mentioning that if we were to create curved spline-based tracks, it should work. At this point, we have functional trains that arrive in stations and you can get on board, but we have another problem. You can also jump on the tracks, and that's not good. So in order to fix that, whenever the track is empty, the game places a big invisible collision wall right at the edge of the platform, preventing players from walking off of it. As soon as the train arrives in the station and the doors open, the game removes that invisible wall only to add it back when the doors close. However, our problem doesn't end there. Our train model is shorter than the length of our platform, so we found out that players can jump on the track in front and behind the train while the doors were open. In order to fix this, we used a very janky solution of placing long invisible walls on each side of the train that actually follow the train's movement, covering those gaps in the process. And with the trains functional and the tracks suicide proof, next up we had to figure out what language to use for the foreign signs. We knew we wanted the signs to be in a foreign language that is difficult to read, but not impossible. After all, the player doesn't have to understand the meaning of the word, they just have to identify it visually and match it to the text on their piece of paper, which is in a different font on purpose. In order to achieve that, we have to make sure that the selected language is spoken by a fairly small number of people to ensure that most players will get the experience of not understanding it. Based on those criteria, anything like Hindi or Chinese were excluded strictly based on their popularity. We researched a handful of languages like Thai and Sindhi, but they were either too difficult to read or we had technical problems with the in-game fonts. Due to the tight game jam deadline, we were also limited with how far we can push the game's graphics, so for that reason we opted for simple low poly shapes with solid colors as textures and a very heavy fog in order to mask the lack of details and create a moody and potentially spooky atmosphere. This led us in the thematic direction of old Soviet-era subway, which dictated the style of our mood boards, 3D models, sound design, and eventually the language we ended up going with. We knew we wanted a Cyrillic alphabet, but Russian is still a very popular language. There are other languages using the Cyrillic alphabet like Serbian and Ukrainian, but they are also very closely related to Russian. So in the end we went with Bulgarian, which is, at least to our knowledge, the most distant language from Russian that still uses the Cyrillic alphabet. So with the help of our writer Pasho and translating assistance from Alexey, we created names for all the stations. I was careful to specifically pick words that are least likely to be understood by native Russian speakers, just in case. Thematically, we also wanted to infuse each station's name with some sort of meaning. So each of the 4 colored lines ended up representing a season of the year, and each of the small stations on that line has a name representative of an object or activity related to that season. The big junction stations are using words that combine the 2 seasons intersecting at that specific point. For example, at the intersection between winter's blizzard and pole and autumn's harvest and cinnamon, we have decay. And speaking of decay, Because the player has to wait for trains to arrive every couple of minutes, we thought it would be cool to have other passengers on the platform also waiting for the train that you can potentially interact with. Given the Soviet era vibes and the thick fog, those passengers turned into ghosts at one point during development, and we somehow agreed that the player character is also dead. Potentially also a ghost. This was partially a thematic decision, but also partly a time-saving one, because it turns out you don't have to create texture variants for transparent glowing ghosts. You also don't have to animate a walk cycle for them either, you just use a sine wave to have them slowly float up and down. The ethereal look and poses were created by our artist Lenny. We manually placed spawn points for ghosts at each station and set a probability percentage of ghosts appearing in those points. The player can simply walk up to a ghost to trigger an interaction, and I wanted to specifically avoid requiring a button input from the player in order to engage in conversation, because it would require an explanatory button prompt UI on the screen, and that goes against the diegetic design pillar. That being said, due to the time and budget constraints, voice acting was not an option, so we had to go with a traditional text dialogue, which goes a little bit against the whole diegetic design, but it feels like a good compromise rather than giving up dialogue completely. We tried to keep the conversation interaction UI minimal and avoid any unnecessary elements like borders or text containers. We even went as far as replacing the default arrow cursor with a vague floating whisper-like blurred circle to keep with the theme. We had to make sure the options you hover your cursor over have pretty big hitboxes and become highlighted in a very obvious way to account for the lack of an arrow pointer on your cursor. And with the dialogue systems now functional, it was time to inject each ghost with some sort of personality. This was the first time both me and Pasho designed and wrote dialogue for a game. We did not have any prior experience with narrative branching, so we tried to keep the structure of the dialogue very simple. Initially, we used a game dialogue library called Yarn, which proved to be a bad idea for a game jam. It was very difficult to implement, and the text editor we used called Yarn Spinner, even though it was nice and visual, it was incredibly buggy, to the point where it was almost unusable. A character's dialogue looked something like this, and the way the game knew the order of things is by checking the number of indents before each sentence. This meant that being off by a single indent anywhere in the file resulted in a conversation ending prematurely without any notice, which is what ended up happening with some of the characters we haven't checked well enough. This required a lot of time on our end to get things right and make sure we achieved the bare minimum of functionality in the version of the game we shipped at the end of the jam. After the deadline, we gave up on Yarn and migrated to Inky, a much better and elegant solution that was easier to work with and suited our needs better. In the end, Pasho created an impressive roster of 25 individual ghost characters, each with their own names, quirks, and personalities. This included a handful of joke characters that had very short dialogue in foreign languages in order to bump up the variety of interactions. The conversations were structured in such a way that each ghost would have a little story for you, told in 3 to 4 short paragraphs. Even though each ghost has their own unique name, in our attempts to avoid any unnecessary UI elements, we don't actually display those on screen. Instead, we opted for some of the ghosts to bring up their own name naturally in conversation. This comes into play later on when I'll be talking about the ending of the game. We also wanted to convey a bigger theme throughout the conversations and put a little bit more focus on world building, not just random flavor text. So ghosts will bring up certain interesting narrative concepts, such as the difficulty of getting to your destination stop is correlated with how you lived your past life, resulting in certain ghosts roaming those stations for decades and some even refusing to go to their destination out of fear of what comes next. We also came up with a handful of humanizing traits, like a fresh ghost that arrived on the platform minutes ago, being as lost as you are, or a ghost trying to kill themselves by jumping in front of the train only to phase through its walls and end up riding it. But even though they have interesting stories to tell, could we maybe use ghosts for a little bit more than just flavor text? I am personally a huge fan of invisible design, little things that the game does to make your experience more pleasant without the player ever realizing. When it comes to tutorials, normally, especially in the context of a game jam, most games would have a screen before you start playing with a wall of text explaining how to play the game and what you have to do in order to win, sometimes accompanied by a cacophony of button prompts that you are somehow supposed to memorize before even playing the game. I absolutely hate that, and I think the best kind of tutorial is a fully invisible one. So despite the time limitations, I tried to design an invisible tutorial with the tools and limitations we had as well as the game's mechanics in mind. First of all, I started with the assumption that the player's gaming literacy is at a level where they know you move around with WASD and control the camera with the mouse, so I intentionally left those concepts out of the tutorial. When you start the game, the very first moment when you spawn, we made sure your camera is pointed downwards, towards a note with your destination written on it. This instantly communicates to you what your goal is. The text on the note is also colored to match the color of the line your destination stop is on, and even though it's not meant to be a revelation at the point when the player sees it, it's a subtle nudge in the right direction. Because the player most likely won't be able to read that Cyrillic station name, it's important to highlight it by making sure nothing else on the screen is competing for the player's attention. After a second or two, the player realizes that they are free to look around, away from the note, at which point it's subconsciously registered that the note can be accessed at any time by simply looking down. I was inspired by the map in Minecraft and how easy and natural it feels to look down towards a piece of paper. I like this method a lot because I think it's clean, very elegant and non-intrusive, and it doesn't require any UI displaying a button prompt or any text on how to go back to that piece of paper. And best of all, it fits the game's diegetic philosophy. Now, due to the tight deadline, we had a limited number of ghost dialogues, so later on, in order to make sure we minimize the possibility of an interaction repeating, we added a system that picks which dialogue to assign to each ghost at the exact point you start interacting with that ghost, sort of like Schrodinger's dialogue. This allows us to always pick a dialogue interaction you haven't seen yet in that playthrough, assuring that you'll go through all of them in a pseudo-random order before any dialogue repeats. This is called the random bag method. This also allows us to use this system for our invisible tutorial. We have two dialogues that are written to act as sneaky tutorials, revealing the basic mechanics of the game and subtly hinting the player towards their goal. Disguised as regular interactions with random ghosts, we made sure they mentioned some crucial pieces of information. For example, that the text on your piece of paper is your destination and that you might find a map at junction stations. And so we made sure that whatever two ghosts you first interact with, regardless of where they are, they will always trigger these two sneaky tutorial dialogues. Initially, we had a predefined tutorial ghost on the same station you spawn on. However, this doesn't assure that every player will interact with that tutorial ghost before they leave the station. This way, with the random bag method, the player has the freedom to go wherever they want, while we have the assurance that they will eventually interact with a ghost and get to see that tutorial dialogue instead of missing it completely. We also structured the initial two tutorial dialogues to not feel like you are stuck in them. We didn't want to make the dialogue the equivalent of a pop-up screen or anything intrusive, so even though you might quit the conversation early, the ghost still gives you a condensed piece of information as a goodbye message that might be useful for your journey. Now, there are a lot of ways to influence the player's behavior through mechanical systems and visual cues, but could we also maybe do it with sound? Given the mood and tone of the world we were building, we knew that sound had to play an important role cementing that diegetic feel. The most mechanically important piece of sound we added to the game was the train jingle. We ripped this straight from a random YouTube video of Tokyo train sounds, and every time a train is about to arrive in a station, a little distorted jingle plays. This was designed through repeated use and observation to hopefully evoke a Pavlovian response from the player. So even if they are not looking towards the train tracks, the player would know that a train is about to arrive in the station strictly from the existence of that sound. Another example of this is when the player starts a conversation with a ghost, we duck most of the environmental sounds. That means that any sound not related to the dialogue gets lowered in volume in order to create the feeling of focusing on the ghost you're talking to. However, we don't lower the volume of the train jingle because that is more of a gameplay related functional sound rather than a flavor one. Ryan, the sound designer, implemented Fmod to the project and took recordings from friends making train announcements in various languages. He then paired them with other train-related sounds before applying a variety of effects on them to make them sound like they belong in the game's universe. I specifically wanted a distant, distorted, echoey feel to most sounds given the huge halls the sound can reverberate around, so the distortion pipeline was as follows. Get recording of a friend making an announcement. Clean it up by removing the background noise and alter its timing by stretching it slightly to make it more otherworldly.
gölgeiztasunnu.
Cut out the high and low frequencies.
Sonra kıtırak gölgeiztasunnu.
Apply a healthy dose of distortion.
Sonra kıtırak gölgeiztasunnu.
Use a heavy amount of echo and reverb.
Sonra kıtırak gölgeiztasunnu.
After which we pair it with various train-related sounds. So by starting out with this,
Sonra kıtırak
we ended up with something like this. On top of sampling various sounds and applying effects to them, Ryan also suggested placing physical sound emitters within the game's models, causing the sound to physically belong in the game's world. For example, a very cool instance of this is how the audio is affected depending on if you are inside or outside the train. Walls muffle any sounds passing through them, and this applies to the train doors as well. So while you're inside the train, any sound effects emitting from outside of it will sound muffled. That is, until the doors open. We thought this was very cool. We also have a lot of world building type of sounds designed to sell the illusion of actually being on a subway station, like hearing the wind if you lean over the edge of the platform. Or the subtle electrical buzz vending machines make when you're right next to them. And even the more surreal and ethereal sound the ghosts emit when they are close by. Although sound design is not without its own problems. Due to us getting greedy and adding a lot of sounds to the project, in the Game Jam version of the game, the audio ends up cutting out completely every now and then because of a buffer overload. Which basically means that the game is trying to play too many sounds at once and only a few of them end up coming through. It's worth noting that most of these world building sound effects I just mentioned we added after the Game Jam has ended, in the polished 2.0 version of the game. All in all, the sound was universally praised by the players as contributing a lot to the experience. But there were also other things that the players had to say about the game. Once the Game Jam deadline hit, we uploaded the game to the website and also sent it to some friends to get some feedback. Most players finished the game in roughly 20 minutes, which is pretty much spot on the time I was aiming for with the map layout and the frequency of small and big junction stops. Out of the 6 of my friend playtesters, the time they took to finish their first play session had an error margin of only 3 minutes. I was very happy with these results. The length of the session could be easily controlled by altering the frequency and speed of trains as well as the frequency of the ghosts. A more difficult way to extend the playtime would be to increase the scope of the map, but we weren't really planning on doing that anyway. However, even with only 20 minutes of game time, there was one common complaint from almost every single playtester. The game was boring. Due to the tight deadline of the Game Jam, we didn't have time to properly control the information density within the train stations as well as inside the train. And given the mechanic of waiting for a train to arrive at your platform, it resulted in players getting bored without anything to keep them engaged, losing focus in the process. Even though we were aware of this problem early on and we added the ghosts with the hopes of combating this exact issue, due to our implementation of the dialogue system, players reported that they weren't really interacting with the ghosts because they were worried they would miss their trains. Now, this is a very interesting claim, given that the only penalty of missing a train is having to wait around 30 extra seconds for the next one to show up. However, players felt the pressure of catching the train, which was a fascinating realization for me. In the Game Jam version, ghosts started a dialogue with you if you were simply close enough to them. This resulted in you not being able to move until you exit the conversation. It also meant that sometimes conversations were triggered without the player's intent, purely by mistake, because your collision box happened to intersect with a ghost even when you were not looking. On top of that, exiting the conversation also took an extra 3 seconds due to a limitation of the text management tool we were using. This only added to that looming feeling of potentially missing the train. So as a result, we implemented a series of changes. In version 2.0 of the game, the ghosts only initiate a conversation if they are in the center of your vision cone. This means that you cannot bump into them while looking away, and it also means that you can easily walk past them even though they are in your peripheral vision. This allows players to run by ghosts to catch their train, while previously this would have triggered a conversation. But that was still not good enough. With this cone method alone, if there is a ghost behind you and you quickly turn to catch a train, a conversation would trigger. So on top of that, we added a check that requires a ghost to spend at least 0.3 seconds inside that vision cone before the conversation is triggered. Also, exiting the conversation is now instant. We have changed the text management tool we were using, and the final goodbye sentence now floats next to the ghost's head while the player regains control over their character instantly without having to wait at all. Oh, and we tweaked the animation times and the collision box sizes to make this interaction even smoother. We also tweaked the spawn points of ghosts and their walking range to make sure that they will never be right in front of a subway train door, resulting in a potentially unwanted interaction. So on each station, including the train itself, we hand-placed the spawn points in the best locations as far away from the doors as possible. And additionally, we were also considering making the ghosts turn around and walk away from you when you exit the conversation. However, this raised several problems, including the ghosts wandering outside their walking range, colliding with other hitboxes, and potentially phasing through walls, which would kind of make sense for a ghost, but it would still look wrong. Now, that's all good for improving the way ghosts work, but those changes don't fix the game is boring problem. So what did we do about that? Without implementing new mechanics or ways to interact with the environment, we opted for implementing a variety of posters populating both the station as well as the inside of the trains themselves. These are the abstract works of Beeple. Taken from his Instagram with his approval, they act as eye candy, increasing the information density by just enough in order to keep the players engaged for the crucial extra handful of seconds until they hear that audio cue that the train is about to arrive. The game automatically randomizes their graphics and spawns them in hand-placed poster frames prefabs, after which the color is adjusted to help them match and blend in with the surrounding station colors. Another interesting piece of feedback we got was players complaining that they were not able to jump, and we can totally relate to that. We avoided adding jumping in the game during the game jam because of the potential bugs it could create, from oversight when it comes to collision boxes in level design and preventing the player from jumping outside the level by mistake, stuff like that. So we immediately added the ability to jump after the game jam ended, even though it doesn't benefit the game mechanically at all. However, I think the inability to jump is more distracting than implementing it as a form of fidgeting for the player. We also added a sneaky sprint feature for those who are curious enough to try out buttons to see if they do anything. Even though these changes didn't make it in the original game jam version, we were pretty happy with what we achieved in only 3 days. If you'd like to try out the game jam version, you should be able to find it in the game's folders, by the way. However, there was one aspect of the game that did not end up as we intended in that initial game jam version. In the original version of the game, when you reach your destination stop, you see a red ghost, you interact with it, and after a few flavor sentences, the screen abruptly cuts to black and a pretentious conclusion fades on the screen. This was not the ending we had in mind, but it was all we could put together in that time frame while still having a functional game. We had many propositions for ending possibilities, like maybe the red ghost tells you to turn your piece of paper around only to find out some extra piece of information on its back, or maybe you finally escape the subway station and you go outside, or maybe you find out that you're in hell and there is no escape. One especially silly idea was that you find out that this was the first step in your journey and next up you have to navigate an airport terminal. Lovely. But none of those felt right. I wanted an ending that ties together the whole experience, and in that initial version of the game, the ghosts felt like more of a decoration rather than a mechanic that benefited the game. They were added with the intention of keeping the player busy while they were waiting for the train, so they were designed to tell you stories, but the problem was those stories didn't benefit the core gameplay loop at all, and I wanted to change that. So with that in mind, in the new 2.0 ending, when you reach your destination station, you see the final ghost, and when you interact with it, you are asked exactly 5 questions. These are designed to look visually pleasing, with a disconnected, smooth floating camera acting as the background. Now, the thing about those questions is that based on how you play the game, they have the potential of being completely fake. If you haven't interacted with any ghosts, these 5 questions are purely flavor. They don't have a correct answer, and the game doesn't even keep track of which answers you pick. And after you answer those fake questions, you get what we call the neutral ending. However, there is a good ending though, and you can get it only if you interact with at least a handful of ghosts and listen to their stories throughout your playthrough. During your conversations, at one point, most ghosts will reveal an important piece of information that you will be asked about later during your interaction with the end ghost. We call this a ghost question. So depending on how many ghosts you've interacted with, those initial 5 fake questions will be replaced with real ghost questions. We use used a special command embedded in the dialogue text itself to make sure that you won't be asked about any story that didn't physically show up on your screen. So if you answer 3 of the real ghost questions correctly, you get the good ending. This way, players who rush through the game get an okay ending, while those who take their time have a slightly more difficult quiz at the end with the added chance of getting a more satisfying conclusion. Since different players have different playstyles, it was important for the neutral ending to avoid having any negative connotations, so the player doesn't feel punished that they didn't talk to ghosts because they simply didn't want to. We just wanted to hint that there is more to be found, encouraging the player to potentially try again instead of punishing them. I think the player would feel cheated at the end finding out that talking to ghosts was a requirement for the good ending instead of an option, resulting in an unsatisfactory conclusion. At this point, we were pretty happy with the proper ending implemented in the game. However, there were a lot of ideas that didn't make it even in the updated version of the game. With the post-game jam version 2.0, we wanted to polish up the experience and make it more accessible without increasing its scope. I was very wary of my tendencies of adding feature creep in all my projects, so I wanted to avoid that for this one. So with that in mind, I made the decision of leaving out several early ideas we had during the game jam. For example, one of the ideas to add complexity to the puzzle was having 2 types of trains, a local one that stops at all the stations and an express one that only stops at the junction stations, or train schedules based on the days of the week, where certain types of trains only stop at certain stations on weekdays, similar to how things are in the New York City subway. This would have required us to communicate what day of the week it is somewhere diegetically, and we either did that through the environment or we could write it on the piece of paper you start with. However, if it wasn't written in English, it was almost impossible for the player to read it, while if it was in English, it wouldn't fit with the rest of the world, given that your destination is written in Cyrillic. For a long time, we wanted to add the ability for ghosts to give you directions, with the potential of certain ghosts giving you wrong directions on purpose. This would probably end up being more confusing to the player than adding value and complexity to the gameplay puzzle. The problems associated with this design is that if the ghosts give you directions through text, we must differentiate between the left and right sides of the platform and label them appropriately so they are still identifiable regardless of the direction in which the player is looking. Alternatively, the ghost could give you directions in the form of an animation, pointing to the side you have to take, but that would require extra time to create those animations and make sure that they look good, and also test every ghost skin variation to make sure nothing breaks, which is very tedious. We also had the idea of junction stations where you don't have to walk from a platform to another, but instead different colored trains would come on the same line, and you would have to pay attention to the color of the train. This meant that the overall color of the station could not be a single color, resulting in potential confusion. Some players suggested that we should add missions assigned to you by ghosts in the style of fetch quests that require you to go to a specific station and bring something back to them, or the ability to help guide ghosts towards their destination stops. Most of these ideas would either make the puzzle too complex without adding value or depth to the gameplay loop, or they would introduce the wrong kind of artificial difficulty to the project, which I was purposefully trying to avoid. In the end, I'm pretty happy with how the project turned out with the resources and time we had on hand. One final thing to mention before I conclude this video would be the alternative names we had for this project. Initially, it was called Project Metropole, mostly because we needed an urgent name for our repository, but we also had alternatives such as Project Platform, or one of my favorites, Metronome, encompassing both the word metro and describing the cyclical nature of the gameplay loop. But in the end, we went with a shortened version of what we thought was the most fitting name: Lost in Trainslation.